this anyway. One thing I keep forgetting to mention, and I should have, is Pope Gregory the Great. I should have mentioned him in connection with the beginning of the last chapter, because he was Pope in around the 500s. But he's remembered by us particularly for setting up the Gregorian calendar, which we still use. Before his time, they'd used the Julian calendar, and the Julian calendar proved to be off by about 3 or 4 days every 100 years. Well, over a period of several hundred years, that would wind up to being quite a bit off. But what you want to do with the calendar is keep the equinoxes and the solstices occurring approximately the same day. You know, in about 4 weeks we'll have a winter solstice. That's where the sun gets as far south as it's going to get, and then starts heading north again. But anyway, Pope Gregory. Now, there's something else I want to say. He's called Gregory the Great, and I believe he's just about the only pope who is called the Great. And it has been said that if every pope had been as good as he was, all of Europe would still be Catholic. There would not be any Protestantism. There would never have been a Protestant Reformation, because there would not have been a need for one. Unfortunately, people do not live long, and Pope Gregory did not live forever. But now, well, I'm going to be talking about the popes later, but I want to say this about, if you actually do a study of the popes, which I have done several times, there have been several books written about them, you might notice that some of the personal lives of some of the popes leave a whole lot to be desired. You have to understand, folk, that part of the problem, it was not the popes, it was the people who elected them. And in the case of our own United States, the problem is not our president, the problem is not our House or our Senate. The problem is the people who, if there is a problem, the problem is the people who elect these people to office. And as public morality declines and declines, we can expect the morality of our public officials to get lower and lower with the times. The popes, some of them again had a problem with low public morality. Not Pope Gregory. He was morally upright. I don't want to say morally perfect, but he was morally upright. But some of the popes, their morals were woefully, woefully lacking. All right. I got last time to the Black Death and the period of turmoil it brought to Europe. I think I mentioned this, but just in case, pogrom. That word is in your book in dark, bold letters. I'm looking at page 376. A pogrom, the word is only used in connection with campaigns against Jews. Jewish people. And they became really, really a problem. I'm going to call it a problem for the people who went through the Black Death. In part because the Jews, for some reason, tended to not get the plague as much as other people. And this made people hate them and accuse them of magic and being in cahoots with the devil. The people that day thought that the Jews should be plagued more than the Christians were. Personally, I mean, a lot of people think that the reason the Jews were not plagued as much is because of the Jewish emphasis on cleanliness. If you ever read the books of Moses, Moses commanded the people to be clean, to try to be clean, and to, if they became unclean for any reason, to wash all their clothes, wash out their house, cleanse themselves. So cleanliness is a big part of Jewish tradition, Jewish religion, and this might have been what helped save the Jews from the ravages of the Black Death. Now, the 14th century was a period of crisis for Western Europeans, similar to what the 2nd and 3rd centuries were in Roman times. But the difference was, in Roman times, during the 2nd and 3rd century, the people of that time succumbed and were overcome with a crisis and went into a dark ages. In the 14th century, the people had crisis after crisis, one after another, but they overcame. And instead of going into the Dark Ages, they went into a period of rebirth called the Renaissance. And they actually came out better off for going through the crisis than they had before they went in. But the crisis was not just hundreds of thousands of people dying. That was bad enough. But there was a lot of social upheaval. Trade declined because there were fewer workers to make products. Fewer workers meant that nobility were competing with each other for workers. So wages went up, which wound up being good in the long run. A lot of serfs were able to buy their freedom, which helped to break down the old feudal order. And we're going to find out something else helped to break down the old feudal order also. But any time you transition from one type of order to another, you have problems. I mean, people were born into one order, then as they grow up, well, for instance, if you had been born to nobility to become a knight and then found that the knights were in grave danger on a battlefield because there were weapons now that could be used against you. It's always a time of stress, a time of turmoil when the old ways change. And a lot of people are on tap, let's try to keep the old order, let's try to keep the old ways. And others go on record as saying, no, we must change, the old ways will die hard. And as has been true in a lot of cases, the old ways did die hard, but the new ways came on the scene. And one of the things that broke down was the old feudal order. Peasants were buying their freedom. As they bought their freedom, they were moving into towns, in spite of the fact that death seemed to take over a lot of towns. Nevertheless, the peasants found they had to make a living somewhere. So they began to move into towns, and also they began to feel like they could rise up and fight the old nobility. So peasant uprisings became very commonplace. Now, eventually, folks, it's going to take a long time, hundreds of years, but these peasant uprisings would eventually overthrow the old order. And in Russia, it was to get so bad that the peasant uprising were eventually to replace the old order with a new form of system, a new system called communism. Not that the new system was better, it didn't work. In France, they were eventually to replace the old order with democracy, and the same thing can be said for Great Britain. At that time, it was just called England before it became Great Britain. And in Holland, the same thing. Eventually, these peasant uprisings would have forced the nobility to make concessions to the peasants. It was a time of turmoil for the upper nobility and for even kings, because a lot of times noble families could not produce a male heir. I mean, a nobleman might get married and his wife die or he die before they had a chance to produce a male successor. And this even affected the upper classes. Life was noticeably shorter. Even kings and queens were affected by the Black Death. Europe's population, which had been rising and rising during the 10, 11, and 1200s, rising and rising, all of a sudden took a dip in the 1300s, and it wasn't to be till the mid-1700s, about 1750, Europe recovered. Actually, if you look at it in more detail, in the 1600s, when Europe's population started, it declined again before finally rising in the 1700s. And in every case, folks, I mean, if I'm wrong, I'll welcome you to tell me. In every case, the decline in population was due to a cooling down of the climate, a little ice age. Now, again, the warmer things were, the better things were for life on Earth. The colder it got, the worse things were. Now, that might not happen today. I mean, today we have inoculations, vaccinations against disease. We have better doctors, and we have better means of transportation, better means of getting food. I mean, farmers might experience, one farmer might experience a big crop failure, but his neighbor might have a prosperous time. So we have better methods of feeding ourselves. Anyway, yes?
You said it took a dip in the 13th century or the 1300s?
In the 1300s, yeah, the 14th century. It took a dip in the 1300s, and then took another dip in the late 1600s. Again, a lot of the problem was plague. Of course, there was always smallpox and typhoid fever, diseases we haven't seen in a long time. I will say this about typhoid fever. It hits me personally because my grandmother died of it in 1926 when my dad was only 6.5 years old. So it was a problem even in the 1920s. By the 1930s, the problem had largely gone away. We developed a typhus vaccine. Some worked, but my grandmother caught it, so I named one of my daughters after grandma, whom I never got to see. it affected me personally because my life would have been a whole lot different, I believe, had Grandma lived long enough for my dad to grow up. But that's something else. But you know what? Plagues were a big problem during this time. And Europe went through a period of storms, heavy storms, again, all brought about by a climate change. And folk, we don't know what caused it. Now, I had a student, I believe in my second class, just Wednesday, said, well, should we put out more carbon to make the climate warmer? I said, I don't find any evidence that increased carbon really warms up the climate. I mean, we've been putting out more carbon for the last 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and the climate seems to have leveled off. I mean, well, all right, depending on who you read with, but hey, folks, the climate was getting warmer until the year 1998, and then it seems to have leveled off. They projected, of course, that by now, 2014, the average temperature would be this high. The projection has simply not come to fruition. If anything, the climate is starting to get cooler, but it's so gradual, it's hard to just tell for sure. Again, folks, what I'm talking about is really fundamental history. Even your book mentions the climate appears to have cooled down during these times we're talking about. Now, one of the more famous peasants' revolts occurred in England, where the peasants rose up and demanded reform. King Richard II promised them reform and said, now I'll forget all about this, folk. You go home, and once you go home, I'll make the reforms. So the peasants went home, then Richard sent his troops around and rounded a bunch of leaders up one by one and hung them all, breaking his promise. And without leaders, the peasants could not reorganize to revolt. But eventually, an uprising was to chop the king's head off. It happened in England. The king's name was Charles II. And eventually an uprising in France was to result in the king and queen's head being chopped off. The king's name is Louis XVI, and the queen Marie Antoinette. No, don't write this down because this is second semester of world history. But these peasant revolts were eventually to succeed. And here's why. The peasants greatly outnumbered the nobility. And once the peasants got hold of the gun, folk, it's believed the gun did a lot to promote equality. A serf with a gun could kill an armored knight. A serf with a gun could kill a duke or lord or even a king. And eventually several kings were assassinated. Among them, a couple of, at least one Tsar of Russia, and about 3 or 4 American presidents four American presidents have been assassinated. But the president of France, there were some assassinations that were started. Again, as the peasants realized and poor people realized that with guns they could force the nobility on their terms. Also, the old way of fighting where the nobility had an unfair advantage was to come to an end with an event known as the 100 Years' War, which we'll talk about just in a moment. Your book says that during this time period, when the peasants revolted, their revolts were easily crushed, and the gains that they might have made temporarily were quickly lost. Now that was to be true in the short run. It was not true in the long run. Eventually, the peasantry was to overthrow most of the old nobility until the day you go to Europe and you'd hardly find anywhere where the old landed gentry and old nobility are in charge. They're still there. There's still a duke of this and a count of that and a baron this. England still has its House of Lords, but the nobles have no authority whatsoever. The old nobility ceased to rule Europe largely after World War I, which again, that's a different story. I mean, a story for a later time.